So, as we go into the 1940s and 1950s, we start to see the NAACP emerge as a legal force here in America. I have a few cases here, a few pivotal cases in the civil rights movement I want to talk about very briefly. The first is a case of Smith versus Allwright, and this took place in 1944. Smith versus Allwright banned all white primary elections in America. The idea being that parties got to control primary elections so they could set the requirements for voting. We still see that quite a bit today with states having, loyalty pledges or requiring you to be a registered Democrat or Republican to vote in their primaries. Smith versus Allwright put one restriction on, that you couldn't abridge the right due to race. So all white primary elections were banned, helping give African Americans a greater voice in the electoral process. The next case is Sweat versus Painter. And this was the first part of banning separate but equal. And the University of Texas back at the time had tried to create an all-black faculty at a segregated law school. The idea being that we have equal law schools here. Therefore, it's not illegal under the previous doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, the Supreme Court strikes that down, saying this is not right. You have to let black people into the main law school and cannot segregate it. Finally, we have Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, that ruled in all cases separate is inherently unequal, and the idea of segregated facilities, whether it be schools, train cars, drinking fountains, bathrooms, etc., 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 was banned, and you had to integrate the races legally. So while the Supreme Court was beginning to take notice, Congress had still not done much to ensure the rights of African Americans. So we spend the rest of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century in a world where African Americans have been granted legal rights but don't actually get to practice them. This is where the federal government decided to finally step in, and Congress began to pass some laws. It begins with the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which, it's important to note, isn't the one we typically mean when we say the Civil Rights Act. That one comes later. This served as LBJ's vehicle into national politics and allowed African Americans to sue in federal court if their right to vote had been denied due to race. This was important because states ran elections, and the states were the ones who were deliberately not expanding the franchise to African Americans. Being able to sue in federal court provided a much more friendly jurisdiction and greater likelihood that African Americans would actually have the ability to vote rather than just a theoretical right. The idea that the federal government was going to be involved in helping African Americans vote was a significant advance and meant we were finally on the way to achieving some level of political equality, at least in terms of voting. A side note, Lyndon Johnson was the right person to promote this legislation because, as a Southern senator, he was able to make sure that his Southern colleagues didn't fight the bill. And ultimately, while he didn't win the presidential nomination, he did become Kennedy's vice presidential choice and set up the next era of politics in America. Simultaneously, civil rights leaders shifted their strategy from litigation and working through the courts to engaging in mass protests. They had decided the time was right to engage in outside game and began to mobilize citizens in favor of civil rights legislation. This paired particularly well with the growth of television, where images of black protesters being sprayed with fire hoses, attacked by police dogs, and generally being assaulted by police officers during nonviolent protests played on TVs across America. The profound, disturbing nature of these images and videos really made a huge difference and forced the average American to become aware of how bad things were and what really was going on around the country. Things like the Freedom Rides, where black and white people rode on buses together throughout the South, risking getting beaten or worse for committing the crime of riding together and seeking public accommodations together, helped bring public awareness to this issue and made a real difference in the fight for civil rights. At the same time, we're seeing things like Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, sit-ins, marches, and the emergence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a civil rights leader. Altogether, the effectiveness of protests and outside strategy was a real turning point in the movement.